Welcome back to It Came From the 80s over here on Top 5 Scary Videos. You guys seem to love this series and that makes me so very happy because discussing horror, specifically 80s horror, is perhaps one of my favorite things. But today is a special day because we get to talk about one of the greatest horror movies of all time from one of the kings of horror, Clive Barker. Yep, that's right, this is It Came From the 80s, Hellraiser. Released in 1987, Hellraiser is based upon the novella The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, who also wrote the screenplay and directed the film. Not only did the film quickly become a horror trailblazer, but it also marked Clive Barker's directorial debut, an impressive debut at that. The film itself follows a man named Frank who opens the door to an alternate dimension and has his body torn to pieces by creatures known as the cenobites. Years later though, Frank's brother Larry moves into the now abandoned home with his new wife Julia, who accidentally triggers Frank's resurrection. The movie is wonderfully bloody and crosses boundaries not many had up until that point, particularly diving into sadomasochism and goth culture in horror movies. Now, having been dismayed by prior adaptations of his work, Barker decided to take a jab at directing the movie himself, with the help of Christopher Figg, who agreed to produce, and New World Pictures, who funded the film for $900,000. Production began at the end of 1986 and was made in just 9 to 10 weeks, which is insane. Tracking back to our earlier point about BDSM, the film's working title was actually Sadomasochists from Beyond the Grave, with Barker also toying with the idea of naming the movie Hellbound until Christopher Figg suggested Hellraiser, probably for the best. But let's get to the meat of this video, the reason we're all here, the cenobites. Cenobites are extra-dimensional beings who appear in the novella The Hellbound Heart, the sequels, and of course in the 10 Hellraiser movies. That's right, 10. They are theologians from a religious sect in hell known as the Order of the Gash, describing themselves as explorers in the further regions of experience, and granting sadomasochistic pleasure to those who call upon them. That's right, like I said before, this film is quite literally about pleasure and pain and the boundary that exists between. Now, of course, like most graphic horror movies purely centered on pain and torture, the movie had to make a few cuts after MPAA gave it an X rating. The scenes that were cut are as follows, spoilers ahead if you haven't seen the film. 2.5 shots were excised from the first hammer murder, including a close-up of the hammer lodged in the victim's head. In the scene where Julia murders another man, the actor playing the victim felt that it made more sense for him to do so naked, which I know the scene we're talking about here, but he didn't really need to be naked. The nude murder scene was shot, but ultimately replaced with the semi-clothed version. Close-ups of Kirsty sticking her hand into Frank's stomach, exposing his guts. Longer version of the scene where Frank is being torn into pieces by the cenobites' hooks. Final shot where his head explodes and his brain messily splashes out was also cut. Now, Barker faced a lot of problems regarding censorship, stating in an interview for Samhain magazine, I quote, "Well, we did have a slight problem with the eroticism. I shot a much hotter flashback sequence than they would allow us to cut in. Mine was more explicit and less violent. They wanted to substitute one line of undertow for another. I had a much more explicit sexual encounter between Frank and Julia, but they said no, let's take out the sodomy and put in the flick knife." Oh boy, sodomy. Yeah. The movie was first released in the United States on September 18, 1987 and grossed $14 million in the US and Canada. However, a fact I didn't know was that it was initially banned in Ontario by the Ontario Film and Video Review Board. By a majority vote of 3-2, the film was deemed not approved in its entirety as it contravenes community standards due to its, I quote, "brutal graphic violence with bloodletting throughout, horror, degradation, and torture." However, in August of 1987, the movie was finally passed by the board after several cuts were made to the film. New World Mutual Pictures of Canada were forced to cut around 40 seconds to get the film passed with an R rating. 35 seconds of an extended torture scene featuring hooks pulling apart a body and face were removed, as well as the scene of the squirming rats nailed to a wall. Though saying that, I rewatched Hellraiser the other day and I specifically recall the rats, so liars. Of course, opinions were torn upon the release of the movie. Reviews hailing from London, particularly in Time Out London magazine, referred to the film as, I quote, "Barker's dazzling debut that creates such an atmosphere of dread that the astonishing set pieces simply detonate in a chain reaction of cumulative intensity," and concluded that the film was a serious, intelligent, and disturbing horror film. Melody Maker would even go on to describe it as the best horror film ever to be made in Britain. However, not everyone agreed, of course, with many critics in the US canning the movie. Q stated, I quote, "Hellraiser does have its share of problems, the redubbing of peripheral character with a mid-Atlantic twang, and the relocation of the film in a geographical limbo." The New York Times would go on to state that Barker cast singularly uninteresting characters, while the special effects aren't bad, only damp. Yikes. I mean, damp certainly isn't a compliment. Personally though, some of the special effects haven't aged wonderfully. Hellraiser is still one of the most effective movies out there. I mean, the engineer is by far one of the scariest monsters ever created, and the cenobites themselves are enough to keep you up at night. But what makes the movie so superb is the lore itself, the minute detailing around the lament configuration, the appearances of the cenobites, their entire existence centering on pain and torture. It's all so original and raw, something we rarely get to see these days. In the early 2010s, Time Out conducted a poll with several authors, directors, actors, and critics alike, who have worked within the horror genre to vote for their top horror films. Hellraiser placed at number 80 on their top 100 list. Personally, I would have placed it higher because as iconic as this movie is, it sadly seems to be underrated, even among horror lovers. Sadly, like all great movies, it was announced that a remake would be coming back in 2006. However, for a handful of years, directors signed on and off, with many not being able to agree on a script or leaving due to creative differences. In 2013, Clive Barker himself stated that he would personally be writing the remake of the original Hellraiser, and that he had already completed a deal with Dimension Films' Bob Weinstein. Yikes. He also went on to state that he would be pushing for practical effects rather than CGI, and that the original Pinhead, Doug Bradley, would be reprising the role. Exciting, right? Well, the remake never surfaced, with Barker revealing in 2017 that the script was written and delivered to Dimension years ago. That was the last anyone heard until news of Hellraiser Judgment surfaced. Now this is where things get fishy, because when I read this my blood boiled. As stated, Clive Barker wanted to write and direct the remake himself, considering he wrote the novella and directed the original film. He has every right. Well, after he sent off the script for the remake, he heard nothing until Hellraiser Judgment was released in 2018, a movie which Clive Barker had nothing to do with. Written and directed by the original special makeup effects artist Gary J. Tunnicliffe, the film centers on three police detectives who, investigating a series of murders, are confronted by the denizens of hell. Now of course the film was a flop, with it going straight to DVD, scoring 2.8 out of 5. That's what you get. However, back to the original. Thanks to the reaction to Doug Bradley's performance of the lead Cenobite, it aided in the huge wave of popularity for the movie in the video release market, leading the character to be dubbed Pinhead, and the release of a further 7 sequels, 3 of which were cinematic releases that managed to roughly gross around 40 million in combined domestic takings. As of right now, the film holds a steady 63% on Rotten Tomatoes. I mean, deserves higher, but this is Rotten Tomatoes we're talking about here. They hate everything, like me. Overall, Hellraiser will forever remain one of the greatest horror movies in my opinion, especially one of the greatest supernatural horror movies, with Pinhead becoming one of the most iconic movie villains in history, even though he's not really a villain, but I don't want to get into that right now. Though, like I previously mentioned, the dubbing can be distracting, the overall acting, special effects, and superior story is what makes you keep coming back for more. I love you, Pinhead. Well, there we have it. You guys fans of Hellraiser? Let us know in the comments down below. Before I go though, I just want to respond to a few comments from one of our last videos. Top 5 real hauntings from around the world. Travis Cook said, "If Lucy is a siren, I would definitely crash my boat when I hear her." Well, shucks, how sweet of you. More souls to take. Pazuzu said, "Big fan of Lucy, Morticia Addams meets Emma Bunting." Well, thank you, I appreciate that, but personally I was always a fan of Ginger Spice. I never liked Baby Spice. A Beautiful Twisted Mind said, "After watching Queen Lucy in that hoodie, I have a sudden urge to play Twister. You game, Lucy?" I'm always game. I respect that. Hershenia Rivera Loridio said, "Tell me about yourself, Lucy." Hi, I'm Lucy. That's all you need to know. And on that note, if you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another scary vid. And until next time, see you later.